A young man named Sam had a knack for finding stories online. A thrill seeker, he scoured the darkest corners of the web, hoping to uncover real disturbing horror stories. His friends thought he was strange for this obsession, but he brushed them off. He didn't scare easily, and he loved the adrenaline that came with reading about others' supernatural encounters and close brushes with death. But one night, he found a story that would change everything. The post was simple, buried in an obscure forum he had never visited before. It was titled, "The List of the Lost." Intrigued, he clicked. A user named Watcher9 had written a vague introduction claiming that anyone who read the list would soon be followed by the spirits of those who'd gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Sam smirked. It sounded like some tired internet curse. He almost moved on, but something pulled him back, a strange sensation in the pit of his stomach. He continued reading, and beneath the introduction, there was a list of names, each with a brief description. Sarah M., 19, vanished in 2011 while camping. Her tent was found shredded, her belongings untouched. Ben T., 42, disappeared from his home in 2013, a single shoe left behind, blood pooling on his doorstep. Anna W., 27, last seen in 2015 on a deserted road, her car engine still running. As he scrolled, Sam noticed that each name had a date, getting closer and closer to the present. Despite himself, he felt a chill. These were people from all around the world, their disappearances unconnected, except by this list. The descriptions grew eerier, suggesting the vanishings were marked by increasingly violent scenes. He was about to click away, half wondering if there would be more names. But when he reached the bottom, he saw something that made his stomach drop. Sam L., 24, last seen November 6th, 2024, sitting alone in his apartment, scrolling through a horror story forum. Sam froze. It was today's date. His name, his exact age. The description could have been a mirror. He told himself it had to be a trick, maybe a prank. He looked around, trying to shake off the unease, but the air in his apartment felt thicker, colder. The lights flickered, and the quiet hum of the city outside fell silent. His phone buzzed, and he jumped. A text. It was from his best friend, Chris. "Hey man, you all right? Haven't heard from you all day." Sam replied, "Yeah, just reading some stuff." "Why?" "Just had a weird feeling, I guess. You know, I'm not into that spooky stuff, but thought I'd check on you." Sam chuckled nervously, texting back, "I'm fine. Just going down the rabbit hole again." He set his phone down and took a deep breath. He decided he would leave the forum and shut down his computer for the night. But before he could close the tab, a message notification appeared on the screen. It was from Watcher9, the user who had posted the list. "Did you see the last name?" Sam's heart pounded. How could they know he'd seen it? He typed back, "Who are you?" The reply came instantly. "I'm just the messenger." The lights flickered again, this time going out completely. Sam's computer screen turned black. The only light in the room was the faint glow from his phone. He grabbed it, using it as a flashlight, but his hands were shaking. As he moved through his apartment, a sense of dread overwhelmed him. He heard a soft shuffling sound behind him, then a voice. A whisper, so close he could feel the breath against his ear. "Sam!" He whipped around, but no one was there. Just the darkness, deep and pressing. He bolted for the front door, but the handle wouldn't budge. His fingers fumbled as he tried to unlock it, but it felt as if something invisible was holding it closed. Panicked, he ran to his bedroom and locked himself inside. He could still hear the faint whispering, closer now, pressing against the walls like static. Just as he was about to call Chris for help, his phone buzzed again. He glanced down, expecting to see a message from Chris, but instead there was an unknown number. The message read, "Welcome to the list, Sam." He threw the phone down, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew colder, and he could feel the presence in the room with him, watching, waiting. The last thing he saw before the lights went out entirely was a figure standing in the doorway, shadowed and indistinct. They found his apartment empty the next day. Only his phone was left, lying in the middle of the floor with the screen still lit up. It was displaying a forum post, newly updated. At the bottom of the list, a fresh name had been added. Chris R., 25. Last seen November 7, 2024, searching for his missing friend. A group of college friends rented an old cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. They'd planned a weekend of campfires, ghost stories, and s'mores under the stars. The cabin itself was run down but charming, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and walls covered in faded wallpaper. The only odd thing was the painting that hung above the fireplace. It was a grim portrait of a young girl, her eyes slightly too large and her expression blank, staring straight ahead. No one could quite meet her gaze for long, and they joked about it, calling her Creepy Carrie. Their first night started like any other camping trip, with laughter, drinks, and stories told in the dark. But when it was Drew's turn to tell a story, he smirked and pointed to the portrait. "I heard a story once about people who stare too long at paintings like that," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "They say that if you look into the eyes long enough, you can see the last thing the person in the painting saw before they died." The others laughed nervously, and Jenna, the most skeptical among them, scoffed. "It's just paint and canvas. Nothing happens." "Go ahead then," Drew challenged her. "See for yourself." Jenna rolled her eyes but decided to play along. She stood in front of the portrait, staring directly into the girl's dark, vacant eyes. Silence settled over the cabin as everyone watched, waiting for her to laugh it off. But Jenna didn't laugh. Her face grew pale, her expression frozen. She stood transfixed as if held in place by something unseen. "Jenna?" her boyfriend, Kyle, said, reaching out to shake her shoulder. She flinched, breaking her gaze, and looked around, disoriented. I thought I saw something," she whispered, rubbing her eyes. "It was so weird. It felt like she blinked." Everyone laughed, but there was an edge of unease in the air now. They tried to laugh it off and moved on with the night, but Jenna stayed unusually quiet, glancing over her shoulder at the painting every now and then. The girl's eyes seemed to follow her. Later that night, they all settled into their sleeping bags, the fire crackling in the fireplace. The cabin was pitch black, except for the faint, dying light of the fire. Around midnight, Kyle woke up to the sound of soft shuffling. He assumed it was Jenna heading to the bathroom, but when he reached over, her sleeping bag was empty. He got up, calling her name softly so he wouldn't wake the others. But when he reached the living room, he found her standing in front of the painting again, staring into the girl's eyes with that same blank expression. "Jenna, what are you doing?" he whispered. She didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the portrait. Kyle shook her shoulders, harder this time, but she didn't react. Suddenly the room felt freezing. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the cabin felt utterly silent, as if all the sounds of the night had been swallowed up by something unnatural. Then he heard the faintest sound, like a child's laughter, coming from behind him. He whipped around, but the room was empty. The others woke up, drawn by the strange chill, and gathered around Jenna, who still hadn't moved. It took all of them to finally pull her away from the painting. When she came to, she looked around wildly, her eyes filled with terror. "It was like I could see her life," she whispered. "She was trapped in that house, kept in a dark room. She was alone for so long." And then her voice broke, and she shivered, pulling her knees to her chest. Someone was watching her, getting closer and closer, and then everything went black. They tried to comfort her, assuring her it was just a weird trick of the mind, but no one could ignore the eerie feeling that had taken over the cabin. That night, no one slept. They took turns watching the portrait, unable to shake the feeling that the girl's eyes seemed more alive, as if she was watching them back, waiting. In the morning, they decided to cut their trip short. But when they packed up and went to leave, the front door wouldn't open. No matter how hard they tried, the old wooden door wouldn't budge. Then they heard a creaking sound from behind them. The painting had fallen from the wall. But now, the girl's face had changed. Her eyes were wide with horror, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. Panicking, they searched the cabin for another way out, but all the windows were locked tight, and the rooms seemed darker than before, the corners filled with shadows that moved when no one was looking directly at them. Kyle suddenly remembered an old cellar door they'd seen outside, around the back of the cabin. They ran to it, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. But when they reached the cellar door, it too was locked. In desperation, they began pounding on it, trying to break it down. Then they heard the laughter again, that eerie, childlike giggle, echoing all around them. The shadows in the cabin seemed to grow longer, stretching toward them, as if something unseen was closing in. The last thing they saw before everything went dark was the girl from the painting, standing in the doorway of the cellar, her eyes filled with the same terror they had seen in the portrait. Days later, the cabin was empty, their belongings scattered as if left in a hurry. The only thing left behind was the painting, still hanging over the fireplace. But now, there were more figures in the background, 5 shadowy figures, with expressions frozen in horror, their eyes wide and staring, just like the girls. And if you look long enough, you might feel something watching you too. A young woman named Lila was working a late shift at the library. It was a quiet night, just her and endless rows of books, echoing silence, and the occasional hum of the flickering fluorescent lights. The library was due to close soon, but a patron had left a pile of books on a table in the farthest, oldest corner of the building, and she needed to put them back before locking up. As she walked into the deep aisles, the air grew colder. This section of the library was rarely visited, filled with dusty books that hadn't been checked out in years. Lila gathered the books, one by one, running her finger along their cracked spines and faded titles. The last book caught her attention. Its cover was blank, a dull brown leather with no title, and it looked much older than the others. Curious, she opened it to the first page. Inside, the book was handwritten, the ink faded and smudged. It was a journal filled with entries dated over 100 years ago. Intrigued, Lila began reading. The writer, a man named Thomas, wrote about the strange occurrences he witnessed while working in the library himself. A library that, she realized, was this very one. He described hearing footsteps in the empty aisles, feeling cold spots, and, most disturbingly, seeing a figure lurking among the shelves late at night. "She only appears when the library is empty," one entry read. "I see her silhouette between the shelves, always watching, never speaking." Lila's heart pounded as she continued reading. The entries became more frantic, describing sightings of the woman becoming more frequent. Thomas wrote about waking up in strange places, feeling as though he was being watched, and hearing his name whispered in a voice so soft he could barely make it out. The final entry was written in shaky handwriting, almost illegible. "Tonight, she came closer. Her face was wrong. Too pale, too close. I could feel her breath, cold as ice. She is not alive. I am certain now. And I fear she wants me to stay with her forever." A chill ran down Lila's spine as she looked up from the page. The library was silent, her breaths echoing in the vast stillness. She turned to head back to the front desk, but something made her freeze. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A dark figure slipping behind one of the shelves at the edge of her vision. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Trying to calm herself, she closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. Just a trick of the light, she told herself. Just her imagination. She walked briskly back to the desk, but the strange feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. The entire library felt wrong now, as if she were intruding on a space that wasn't hers. The silence grew oppressive, and every shadow seemed darker, deeper. As she reached the desk, she heard a faint, almost inaudible whisper. Her name. Lila. Her heart raced. She looked around, but the library was empty. Every instinct told her to run, to get out, and never look back. But she was alone, she reasoned, and it was just a voice in her mind, right? Then she saw it. A figure at the far end of the main aisle, standing still as a statue. She couldn't make out a face, only a shadow with long, dark hair. It was too far away to see details, but something felt deeply wrong. The figure just stood there, unmoving, half hidden in the shadows. "Lila," the whisper came again, louder this time, closer. She took a step back, gripping the edge of the desk to steady herself. The figure began to move, gliding silently toward her, its form flickering in and out of the shadows. Every time it reappeared, it was closer. Its face still hidden, but unmistakably turning toward her, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Panicking, she fumbled for her keys and ran for the exit, her footsteps echoing as she rushed through the rows of books. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it following her, keeping pace, the cold air pressing against her back. She reached the door and struggled to unlock it, her hands shaking. Finally, she threw it open and ran outside, gasping for air. The chill of the library clung to her, and as she looked back through the glass doors, she saw the figure standing in the entrance, watching her. Its face, pale and expressionless, was pressed against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, a haunting smile frozen on its lips. She called the library director the next day, told him she couldn't come back. She didn't care about the job. She couldn't shake the feeling of that figure watching her. even in her own home. She threw her uniform in the trash and tried to forget about that night. But a week later, she received an old, dusty package in the mail. Her name was scrawled across it in faded ink. Inside was the same journal she had found that night, the one belonging to Thomas, the former librarian. There was a new entry at the bottom of the last page in handwriting identical to her own. "I can never leave. She won't let me.